Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Horror Halloween. Now I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. My name is Lily, and this is a story about something I wish I could forget. It happened a year ago, but it still haunts me every day. I'm not making any of this up. I couldn't, even if I tried. It started when my grandma passed away. She was a sweet lady, always baking cookies and humming old songs. But there was one thing about her that was strange. She had this old, silver ring that she wore every single day. It had a dark red stone in the middle, like a drop of blood frozen in time. She never let anyone touch it. "It's special," she'd say, her voice suddenly serious. "It's been in our family for generations. But don't ever put it on, Lily. It's not meant for that." I never thought much about it. It was just a ring, right? But after she passed, the ring became mine. When Mom handed it to me, I felt uneasy. It was heavier than I expected, and the silver felt cold, even though it had been sitting in a warm room. "Here," Mom said, her voice shaky. "Grandma wanted you to have it. She said it's your turn to keep it safe." "Safe from what?" I asked, but Mom just shook her head. That night, I couldn't stop staring at the ring. It sat on my nightstand, glinting in the faint moonlight. It was so strange. The red stone seemed to glow slightly, like it had a heartbeat of its own. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then weird things started happening. The first night, I woke up to a loud crash. My lamp had fallen off the nightstand, and the ring was lying on the floor. I could have sworn I left it on the table. Maybe it rolled off? I picked it up and set it back in its place, telling myself it was no big deal. The second night, I had a nightmare. In the dream, I was standing in a dark room with no windows or doors. The only thing in the room was the ring, sitting on a pedestal. A voice whispered, "Put it on." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. I looked over at the ring, and for a second, I thought it moved. By the third night, I was convinced something was wrong. I decided to lock the ring in my drawer, hoping that would help, but it didn't. The nightmares got worse. I'd see my grandma in them, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She'd hold out her hand, the ring on her finger, and say, "You can't escape it, Lily." During the day, things weren't much better. I started hearing whispers when no one was around. My dog, Max, refused to come into my room, growling at the door like something was there. And the worst part? The ring wasn't staying in the drawer. Every morning, I'd find it back on my nightstand, sitting there like it was waiting for me. I told my mom about it, but she just said I was overthinking. "You've been through a lot," she said. "Maybe it's just stress." But it wasn't stress. I knew it wasn't. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to put the ring on, just to see if it would stop the nightmares. Stupid, right? I should have listened to Grandma. The moment I slid it onto my finger, I felt a jolt, like a tiny shock. The room seemed to grow darker, and the whispers got louder. "You shouldn't have done that," a voice said, clear as day. I yanked the ring off, my hands shaking, but the damage was done. That night, I saw her. I woke up to a cold breeze, even though my window was closed. At the foot of my bed stood a figure, shrouded in shadows. It was my grandma, but not really. Her face was twisted, her eyes glowing red, just like the stone in the ring. "Why did you put it on?" she hissed, her voice echoing in my head. "I told you never to wear it." "I'm sorry," I stammered, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't know." She reached out, her fingers claw-like, and pointed at the ring on my nightstand. "You must break the curse," she said, "before it's too late." And then she was gone. The next morning, I packed up the ring and went straight to my mom. "We need to get rid of this," I said. Mom's face went pale. "We can't," she whispered. "It's part of the family." "I don't care," I shouted. "It's cursed." Grandma told me we have to break the curse. Mom finally agreed to help me. We started digging through old family journals, looking for clues. That's when we found out the truth. The ring had belonged to an ancestor of ours named Margaret, who lived in the 1800s. She was accused of witchcraft and sentenced to death, but before she died, She cursed the ring. She swore it would bring misfortune to anyone who wore it. Apparently, every generation had someone who was chosen to keep the ring. And now it was my turn. I was terrified, but I knew I had to do something. Grandma said to break the curse, but how? After weeks of research, we found an old ritual in one of the journals. It involved burying the ring at a crossroads under the light of a full moon. It sounded ridiculous, but I was willing to try anything. That night, Mom and I drove out to the middle of nowhere. We found a crossroads and dug a small hole. I placed the ring inside, my hands trembling, and we covered it with dirt. As we stood there, a cold wind blew through the air, and for a moment, I thought I heard laughter. But then, everything went quiet. The nightmares stopped after that. Max came back into my room, wagging his tail like nothing had happened. And the ring? It never came back. I'd like to think the curse is broken, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers, and I wonder, is it really over? My name is Sarah, and I'm about to tell you a story I never thought I'd share. It happened when I was 16, during the summer I spent at my grandparents' house. What I experienced there changed the way I see the world forever. My grandparents lived in a creaky old farmhouse at the edge of town. It was one of those places that seemed to hold on to the past, with faded wallpaper, squeaky floorboards, and an attic that no one ever went into. "Don't bother with the attic," Grandma said on my first day there. "It's just full of old junk." But of course, being 16 and curious, that warning only made me want to see it more. One afternoon, while my grandparents were out running errands, I decided to sneak up there. The attic door was at the end of a narrow hallway, hidden behind a heavy wooden panel. I had to tug on it hard to get it open. The stairs creaked as I climbed, and the air grew colder the higher I went. The attic was dimly lit by a single dusty window, and the smell of old wood and mildew filled the space. Boxes and furniture were piled everywhere, but one thing caught my eye immediately: a doll sitting on a rocking chair in the corner. It was an old porcelain doll, with curly brown hair, glassy blue eyes, and a frilly white dress. There was something about it that made me shiver. Its face was too perfect, too lifelike, and the way its eyes seemed to follow me sent a chill down my spine. I reached out to touch it, and as soon as my fingers brushed its hand, I heard a soft creak behind me. Whipping around, I saw nothing but shadows. Just the wind, I told myself, though there wasn't a breeze in the attic. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the doll. I kept picturing its glassy eyes and the strange, almost smug expression on its face. I decided to ask Grandma about it the next day. When I mentioned the doll, she froze. Her cheerful face turned pale, and she set down her teacup with a trembling hand. "You saw her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, confused. "What's the big deal?" "It's just a doll." Grandma shook her head. "No, Sarah, that doll is cursed." She explained that the doll had belonged to her great-aunt Clara, a woman who had lived a troubled life. Clara had been an outcast in the family, accused of dabbling in dark magic. When she died, the doll was found in her room, sitting on her bed. Strange things started happening after Clara passed, Grandma said. People heard footsteps in empty rooms, doors would slam on their own, and anyone who touched the doll, she trailed off, looking away. "What happened to them?" I asked, my heart racing. "They were never the same," Grandma said. "It's like the doll drained them, piece by piece." I laughed nervously, thinking she was trying to scare me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was serious. The next few days were uneventful, and I started to convince myself that the doll was just a creepy old toy. But then the nightmares began. In the first dream, I was standing in the attic, and the doll was sitting on the rocking chair, staring at me. Its eyes blinked, and its lips curled into a smile. "Why did you touch me?" it whispered. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding. The next morning, I decided to stay out of the attic. But no matter what I did, I felt like the doll was watching me. I'd catch glimpses of it out of the corner of my eye, even though I knew it was still up in the attic. One night, I woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards. It was coming from the hallway outside my room. Holding my breath, I listened as the footsteps grew louder, stopping right outside my door. I wanted to scream, but fear kept me frozen. The doorknob rattled, and then, slowly, the door creaked open. There, standing in the doorway, was the doll. Its glassy eyes locked onto mine, and it tilted its head, as if studying me. Then, it spoke in a voice that was both high-pitched and distorted. "You shouldn't have touched me, Sarah." I scrambled out of bed, backing away until I hit the wall. The doll stepped closer, its porcelain face gleaming in the moonlight. "I just wanted to be your friend," it said, its smile widening unnaturally. Before I could scream, the doll lunged at me, its tiny hands reaching for my throat. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and swung it with all my might. The doll shattered into pieces, and I collapsed to the floor, sobbing. When my grandparents rushed in moments later, I tried to explain what happened, but they didn't believe me. The broken doll was gone, and there wasn't a single shard of porcelain anywhere. "You must have had a bad dream," Grandma said, her voice filled with concern, but I knew it wasn't a dream. The bruises on my neck proved that. After that night, I refused to stay in the house alone. I spent most of my days outside, avoiding the attic at all costs. But the nightmares didn't stop. In every dream, the doll was there, piecing itself back together, one shard at a time. On my last day at the farmhouse, I found a note tucked under my pillow. It was written in neat, childlike handwriting and said, "I'll be back." I never returned to my grandparents' house after that summer, and they eventually moved to a smaller place in the city. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear faint footsteps and the creak of a rocking chair, and I wonder, is the doll still out there, waiting for me? My name is Jacob, and this is the story of the summer I spent in my aunt's house. It's a story about a mirror that was far more than it seemed. I've never told anyone about what happened, and even now, I'm not sure if anyone would believe me. It all started when my parents sent me to live with Aunt Clara for a few weeks. They were going through some rough times, and I think they just needed space. Aunt Clara was kind but strange. She lived alone in a massive, crumbling mansion that felt like it belonged in another century. Her house was filled with old furniture, faded paintings, and an endless collection of antiques. But the thing that caught my attention most was the mirror in the upstairs hallway. It was enormous, with an ornate gold frame covered in swirling designs that looked like twisting vines. The glass was cloudy, like it hadn't been cleaned in decades, and yet it reflected things oddly. The first time I walked past it, I thought I saw something move behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there. "What's with the mirror?" I asked Aunt Clara over dinner that evening. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth, and for a moment, she looked genuinely scared. Then she forced a smile and said, "It's just an old family heirloom. Been in the family for generations. Why does it look so weird?" I pressed. She hesitated. "It's unique," she said, but I could tell she wasn't telling me everything. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the mirror. I decided to take another look at it before bed. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single flickering bulb. The mirror loomed at the end, taller than me and almost as wide as the wall. I stood in front of it, staring at my reflection. At first, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed something strange. My reflection wasn't copying me exactly. When I tilted my head, it lagged a second behind. When I raised my hand, it hesitated before mimicking the movement. I took a step closer, my breath fogging up the glass. "What are you?" I whispered. My reflection smiled. I froze. I wasn't smiling. The reflection's grin widened, stretching unnaturally across its face. Then it lifted its hand and waved, even though I hadn't moved. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, and when I looked up again, the reflection was normal. My own terrified face stared back at me, exactly as it should. I ran to my room, slamming the door behind me. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to avoid the mirror altogether, but that didn't stop it from creeping into my thoughts. Every time I walked down the hallway, I felt its presence, like it was watching me. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint scratching, like nails on glass. My heart pounded as I crept out of bed and opened my door. The hallway was dark, but I could see the mirror glowing faintly, as if it were lit from within. I stepped closer, unable to resist the pull. As I approached, the scratching grew louder. It was coming from inside the mirror. Suddenly, the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. My reflection appeared, but it wasn't me. Its eyes were dark and hollow, and its smile was twisted and cruel. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice echoing in my head. I backed away, shaking my head. "Let me out, Jacob," it said again, louder this time. "Don't you want to know the truth?" "The truth about what?" I managed to whisper. It leaned closer, pressing its hands against the inside of the glass. "The truth about your family. About why you're really here." Before I could respond, the mirror went dark. My own reflection returned, looking as shaken as I felt. The next morning, I confronted Aunt Clara. "What's wrong with that mirror?" I demanded. She sighed, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen her. "I was hoping you wouldn't notice," she said, "but I suppose it was only a matter of time." She told me the mirror had been in our family for over 100 years. It was said to have been created by a man who practiced black magic, someone who wanted to trap his enemies in a world they could never escape from. "Some say the mirror holds their souls," Aunt Clara said. "Others think it shows you what you fear most. Whatever the case, it's dangerous. Why keep it then?" I asked, frustrated. "Because we can't get rid of it," she said. "Everyone who's tried has met unfortunate ends." That didn't sit well with me. I couldn't stay in the house with that thing any longer. That night, I made a decision. I was going to destroy the mirror, no matter what it took. I waited until Aunt Clara was asleep and grabbed a hammer from the garage. My hands were shaking as I approached the mirror, but I knew I had to do it. When I raised the hammer, the reflection spoke again. "Stop," it said, its voice softer now, almost pleading. I hesitated. "If you break the mirror, you'll set us free," it said. "Do you really want to risk that?" "Set who free?" I asked. "Us," it said. "The ones trapped inside. The ones your family put here." "What are you talking about?" I demanded. The reflection smiled again. "Ask Aunt Clara about the people who've gone missing. About the debts your family owed. We're not the villains here, Jacob." My grip on the hammer faltered. Could it be telling the truth? Before I could decide what to do, the mirror rippled again, and I saw faces, dozens of them, pressing against the glass, their eyes filled with pain and desperation. "Help us," they whispered in unison. Terrified, I dropped the hammer and ran back to my room. The next morning, I confronted Aunt Clara again. This time, she didn't deny it. She told me about the family's dark past, about how they had used the mirror to trap people who threatened them. They weren't innocent, she said, trying to justify it. They were dangerous. I didn't believe her. I couldn't. That was the last night I spent in the house. I left early the next morning, refusing to look at the mirror as I walked past it one final time. Even now, I can't forget the faces in the glass. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear their whispers, begging for freedom. And I wonder, did I make the right choice? I'm Emma, and this is the story of how a family treasure became my worst nightmare. I've always loved old things, antiques, family heirlooms, anything with history. But after what happened last year, I'm not sure I'll ever feel the same again. It started on my 17th birthday. My mom gave me a small, beautifully carved wooden box. It was old, the kind of thing you'd expect to find in a museum. The top had an intricate design of swirling patterns, with a tiny brass keyhole in the center. "It's a music box," Mom said, smiling. "It belonged to your great-grandmother. She wanted it passed down to you." I turned the key, and the box creaked open. Inside was a tiny ballerina, her porcelain arms outstretched as if she were mid-dance. When I wound it up, a hauntingly beautiful melody played, slow and eerie, like a lullaby sung in a minor key. "It's so pretty," I said, though something about it made my stomach twist. Mom hesitated. "There's something you should know," she said. "Your great-grandmother used to say this music box was special. She believed it. Remembered things. Remembered things?" I laughed nervously. "What does that even mean?" "She thought it captured moments," Mom said, looking uncomfortable. "It's just an old family story. probably nothing to worry about. I didn't think much of it at first. I put the music box on my dresser and forgot about it for a while. But that night, I woke up to the sound of the melody playing softly. At first, I thought it was a dream. But then I saw the box was open, the ballerina spinning slowly in the dim light. My heart raced. I was sure I'd closed it before bed. I got up and shut the lid, making sure it clicked into place. The music stopped, and I crawled back under the covers, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But the next night, it happened again. This time, I stayed awake, watching the box. Just after midnight, the lid creaked open by itself. The ballerina began to spin, and the haunting melody filled the room. I felt frozen, like I couldn't move. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A faint shadow reflected in the glass of the music box. It was shaped like a person, but there was no one else in the room. I slammed the lid shut and shoved the box into my closet, burying it under a pile of clothes. The next day, I told my mom what happened. She brushed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or my imagination. But I knew better. That night, I heard it again. The same melody, coming from the closet. I opened the door, my hands trembling, and found the music box sitting on top of the pile of clothes, its lid wide open. This time, I didn't just hear the melody. I heard whispers, faint and overlapping, like 100 voices murmuring all at once. I grabbed the box and ran downstairs, shaking Mom awake. "Something's wrong with this thing," I said, my voice cracking. Mom's face went pale when she saw the box. She took it from me and studied it for a moment, her hands trembling. "We need to talk," she said. She told me the real story of the music box. It had been in our family for over a century, passed down from generation to generation. But every person who owned it experienced strange things. Voices, shadows, and terrible, vivid dreams. Some even claimed the box showed them visions of the past. Horrible events they couldn't explain. "There's a reason it's been kept in storage for so long," Mom said. "Your great-grandmother believed the box was cursed, that it trapped the spirits of those who died near it. Why would you give it to me?" I asked, horrified. "I thought it was just an old story," Mom said. "I didn't think." She stopped, her voice breaking. We decided to get rid of the box. The next day, we drove to a nearby lake. I threw the box into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, but I told myself it was over. It wasn't. That night, the music played again. I found the box sitting on my dresser, dripping wet, the ballerina spinning to its ghostly melody. I screamed, and Mom came running. When she saw the box, she gasped and covered her mouth. "It came back," she whispered. We didn't know what to do. Every time we tried to get rid of it, burning it, burying it, throwing it away, it would return, always wet and cold, the melody playing louder each time. The nightmares started soon after. I dreamed of people I'd never met, screaming and crying, their faces twisted in agony. In every dream, the music box was there, sitting in the background, its lid wide open. One night, I woke up to find the ballerina missing. The box was open, but the tiny figurine was nowhere to be seen. That's when the footsteps started. At first, they were faint, like someone walking down the hallway. Then they grew louder, heavier, closer. I locked my door and hid under the covers, but the footsteps stopped right outside my room. I heard the doorknob rattle, and then a soft, childlike voice said, "Play with me." I screamed, and the footsteps retreated, fading into silence. The next morning, I begged Mom to help me find a way to break the curse. We spent hours researching, digging through old family journals and letters. Finally, we found a clue. A letter from my great-grandmother, explaining how to banish the box's curse. The ritual was complicated and terrifying. It involved lighting candles, saying an incantation, and smashing the box at midnight, under a full moon. We prepared everything and waited for midnight to come. When the time came, I placed the music box on the ground, lit the candles, and recited the words from the letter. The air grew cold, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding us like a swarm of invisible bees. "Do it now," Mom shouted. I raised the hammer and brought it down with all my strength. The box shattered into a million pieces, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then the whispers stopped, and the room grew warm again. We swept up the shards and buried them far from the house. I haven't heard the melody since, but sometimes, late at night, I think I hear faint whispers, like an echo of something long gone. And I wonder, is the curse truly broken? Or is it just waiting for the next person to find the pieces? My name is Lucas, and this is the story of the black ring that changed my life forever. It was my grandfather's, a thick silver band with an onyx stone set in the middle. He always wore it, never took it off, not even when he was sleeping. I was 13 when he passed away. He'd lived a long, full life, but losing him was hard on all of us. After the funeral, we started going through his things, dividing up what little he left behind. The ring was given to me. "You're the oldest grandson," my dad said, placing the ring in my hand. "Your grandpa wanted you to have it." The metal felt cold against my skin, even though it had been in his possession for decades. The onyx gleamed darkly, almost like it was absorbing the light around it. "It suits you," Dad said with a sad smile. "Wear it with pride." At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just a ring, right? I slipped it onto my finger, and it fit perfectly. Too perfectly, in fact. It was as if it had been made for me. That night, I had the first dream. I was standing in a dark forest, surrounded by towering trees whose twisted branches blocked out the moonlight. In front of me was a figure, a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face obscured by shadows. "Return it," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "What?" I asked, confused. "Return the ring," he repeated. Before I could respond, he lunged at me, his hands clawing at my throat. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I told myself it was just a nightmare, nothing more. But when I looked at the ring on my finger, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with it. The next day, strange things started happening. It began with whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the whispers grew louder, clearer. They always said the same thing. "Return the ring." I tried taking it off, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard I pulled, the ring stayed firmly in place. The skin beneath it began to itch, then burn, as if the metal was searing into my flesh. I showed it to my parents, but they just laughed it off. "It's probably just in your head," my mom said. "You're stressed from everything that's happened," but I knew better. Over the next few weeks, the dreams got worse. Every night, I found myself back in the forest, facing the shadowy figure. Each time, he got closer, angrier. "Return it," he shouted in one dream, his voice echoing like thunder. His face was still hidden, but his eyes glowed red, burning with rage. I started noticing things around the house, too. Objects would move on their own. Chairs scraping across the floor, doors slamming shut, lights flickering. And then there were the shadows. They crept along the walls, dark and shapeless, moving against the light. I'd see them out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, they'd vanish. One night, I woke up to find a shadow standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and thin, its body rippling like smoke. It didn't have a face, but I could feel it staring at me. "Return the ring," it whispered, its voice cold and hollow. I screamed, and the shadow dissolved into the darkness. That was the breaking point. I knew I had to do something. I started researching the ring, digging through old family records and asking relatives about its history. Most of them didn't know much, but my grandmother finally gave me some answers. She told me the ring had been in the family for generations, passed down from father to son. But it wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a curse. The ring had belonged to a man named Victor Blackwood, a distant ancestor who was rumored to be a sorcerer. He'd used the ring in rituals, channeling dark energy through the onyx stone. When Victor was accused of witchcraft, the townspeople dragged him from his home and burned him at the stake. But before he died, he cursed the ring, vowing that anyone who wore it would suffer as he had. Why didn't Grandpa tell me this? I asked, horrified. He didn't believe in the stories, Grandma said. Or maybe he thought the curse had skipped him. But it's real, Lucas. You have to find a way to break it, Breaking the curse wasn't going to be easy. According to the old family journals, the only way to free myself was to return the ring to Victor's grave. The problem was, no one knew where he was buried. I spent weeks searching, piecing together clues from old maps and letters. Finally, I found it. A forgotten cemetery deep in the woods, overgrown with weeds and half-sunken gravestones. I waited until dusk, when the shadows stretched long and the air was thick with the scent of pine. With a flashlight in one hand and a shovel in the other, I ventured into the cemetery, searching for Victor's grave. It didn't take long to find it. His headstone was larger than the others, marked with the same swirling patterns as the ring. I knelt beside the grave and began digging. The earth was cold and heavy, and every stroke of the shovel felt like it took an eternity. Finally, I hit something solid. It was a small wooden box, its surface rotted and covered in moss. I pried it open, and inside was another ring, identical to the one on my finger. The moment I touched it, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The shadows gathered around me, swirling and writhing, their voices blending into a single word: return. I placed the ring in the box and slammed the lid shut. The shadows froze, then began to dissolve, their forms melting into the air. The ring on my finger loosened. I pulled it off and threw it into the box, burying it as quickly as I could. As I patted down the dirt, the whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, I felt free. I left the cemetery without looking back. The weight of the curse finally lifted. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the forest, and I wonder if the curse is truly gone, or if it's just waiting for someone else to find the ring. My name is Ava, and I never believed in curses until the mirror entered my life. It was a family heirloom, passed down from my great-aunt Clara, who was always a bit peculiar. She never married, never had children, and lived alone in a crumbling Victorian house on the edge of town. When she died, my mom inherited most of her belongings, including the mirror. It was beautiful, I'll admit that. The frame was ornate, carved from dark wood, with swirling patterns of ivy and roses. The glass was slightly fogged, as if it had seen too many years and too many reflections. "It's an antique," Mom said, admiring it. "Probably worth a fortune." She hung it in our living room, right above the fireplace. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just a mirror, right? But then things started happening. The first time I noticed something strange, I was home alone. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I felt like I was being watched. I looked up and saw my reflection in the mirror. Except it wasn't quite right. My reflection was smiling, even though I wasn't. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the mirror, willing my reflection to move, to prove I was imagining things. But it didn't. It just kept smiling, a slow, eerie grin that didn't match the fear I felt in my chest. I bolted from the room and didn't go back until my parents came home. When I told them what I saw, they laughed it off. "It's just your imagination," Dad said. "Mirrors can play tricks on your eyes." I wanted to believe him, so I convinced myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that mirror. The next few days were uneventful, and I started to relax. But then I began hearing whispers. They were faint at first, like a distant breeze, but they grew louder each night. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was cold and menacing, like someone, or something, was angry. One night, I decided to confront the mirror. I stood in front of it, staring at my reflection. My face looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface. "Who are you?" I whispered. The room was silent, but my reflection leaned closer, its movements independent of mine. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, my heart racing. My reflection returned to normal, mimicking my every move, but I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen. I told my mom again, begging her to get rid of the mirror. "It's been in our family for generations," she said. "Your great-aunt Clara loved that mirror. There's no way it's cursed." I wanted to argue, but I knew she wouldn't listen. That night, I had my first dream. I was standing in a dimly lit room, surrounded by mirrors. They lined the walls, reflecting each other in an endless loop. In the center of the room was a figure, a woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing. "Free me." I woke up drenched in sweat. The woman's face burned into my mind. The next morning, I did some research. I found old photos of my great-aunt Clara and discovered something chilling. In every picture, the mirror was there, hanging on the wall behind her. And in every photo, there was a shadowy figure in the glass, a woman with long, dark hair and hollow eyes. The same woman from my dream. I confronted my mom again, showing her the photos. She finally admitted that Clara believed the mirror was haunted. She used to say it was a window to another world. Mom said, her voice trembling, but those were just stories. Clara was eccentric. She made up things to scare people. What if it's true? I asked. Mom didn't answer. That night, the whispers turned into screams. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and ran downstairs, expecting to find the mirror broken. But it was intact, hanging on the wall as if nothing had happened. The screams stopped as soon as I entered the room, replaced by a deep, suffocating silence. And then I saw her. The woman from my dream was in the mirror, her hollow eyes staring straight at me. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to break through. "Free me," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. The next day, I decided to get rid of the mirror myself. I waited until my parents were out, then took it down from the wall. It was heavier than I expected, the glass cold to the touch. I dragged it outside and into the woods behind our house. I found a clearing and dug a hole as deep as I could, throwing the mirror in and covering it with dirt. For a moment, I felt relief. But when I got back to the house, the mirror was hanging on the wall, exactly where it had been. I stared at it, my hands trembling. The glass was spotless, as if it had never been buried. That night, the dreams came back, worse than ever. The woman didn't just ask for help, she screamed, her face contorted in rage. I woke up to find scratches on my arms, as if someone, or something, had clawed at me while I slept. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I went back to the woods, this time with a sledgehammer. I smashed the mirror into pieces, the glass shattering with an ear-splitting crash. For a moment, the air seemed to shimmer, and I heard a faint whisper. "Thank you." I buried the shards deep in the ground, making sure there was no trace of the mirror left. The dreams stopped after that, and the house felt lighter, as if a dark presence had finally been lifted. But sometimes, when I walk past the spot where I buried the mirror, I feel like I'm being watched. And I wonder if the woman is truly free, or if she's still trapped, waiting for someone else to find the pieces. My name is Emily, and this is the story of a music box that nearly destroyed my family. It belonged to my great-grandmother, who everyone in my family called Nana Rose. She was a kind woman, known for her love of music and her peculiar collection of antique trinkets. The music box was her favorite, a small, intricately designed piece with a glass dome that encased a spinning ballerina. When Nana Rose passed away, my mom inherited the music box. She didn't think much of it and placed it on a shelf in our living room. It sat there for years, gathering dust, until one summer evening when I decided to wind it up. I was 14 at the time, curious and a bit bored. The key turned with a satisfying click, and the ballerina inside began to twirl as a hauntingly beautiful melody played. It was a tune I'd never heard before, slow and mournful, but it sent shivers down my spine. That night was the first time I heard the whispers. At first, I thought it was my little sister, Sarah, talking in her sleep. I got up to check on her, but she was fast asleep, her room silent except for her soft breathing. When I returned to my bed, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, like the walls themselves were speaking. Emily, my name, spoken in a soft, sing-song voice, made my blood run cold. I pulled the covers over my head, squeezing my eyes shut until I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I told my mom what happened, but she brushed it off. "It's just your imagination," she said. "You're probably overtired." I wanted to believe her, but the strange occurrences didn't stop. The music box started playing on its own. I'd hear the melody in the dead of night, faint at first, then growing louder. When I went to check, the ballerina would be spinning under the glass dome, even though no one had wound it. One night, I caught Sarah standing in front of the music box, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Sarah?" I called out, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the spinning ballerina. I grabbed her shoulder, shaking her gently. She blinked, as if snapping out of a trance, and looked at me with confusion. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I don't know," she whispered. I heard it calling me." That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I started researching the music box, digging through old family albums and letters. I found a photo of Nana Rose holding the music box, her face unusually somber. In the corner of the photo was a faint, shadowy figure, a woman with long, flowing hair and hollow eyes. My heart sank as I remembered the whispers and Sarah's vacant stare. I had to find out more. After weeks of searching, I finally found a journal Nana Rose had kept. In it, she wrote about how the music box had been given to her by a traveling merchant when she was a young girl. The merchant warned her that the music box was cursed, but she didn't believe him. She loved the melody too much to part with it. As the years went by, strange things began happening. People who spent too much time near the music box would fall ill, hearing whispers and seeing shadows. Nana Rose wrote that the music box seemed to grow stronger with each passing year, feeding on the fear of those around it. I knew I had to do something. That night, I tried to get rid of the music box. I took it outside, intending to smash it with a hammer, but the moment I raised my arm, the melody began to play. The ballerina spun inside, faster and faster, and the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. "Don't!" a voice screamed, and the hammer flew from my hand, as if yanked away by an invisible force. Terrified, I ran back inside, leaving the music box where it was. The next morning, it was back on the shelf, its glass dome spotless, as if nothing had happened. Desperate, I reached out to my grandmother, the only person who might know more about the music box. When I told her what was happening, her face grew pale. "I should have burned it years ago," she said, her voice trembling. "Your great-grandmother believed she could control it, but she was wrong. That thing isn't just cursed, it's alive." According to my grandmother, the music box housed a restless spirit, a woman named Lila who had been wronged in life and bound to the music box in death. "She's angry," Grandma said. "She wants to be free, but she doesn't know how. She'll keep tormenting anyone who touches the box until she's released." "How do we release her?" I asked. Grandma shook her head. "I don't know. Nana Rose tried everything. Prayers, rituals, even burying it. But nothing worked. I refused to give up. I started researching ways to cleanse objects of spiritual attachments, trying to find a solution. After days of searching, I found a ritual that claimed to free bound spirits. I gathered everything I needed: salt, candles, and a small bowl of holy water. I waited until midnight, when the house was silent and still. Placing the music box in the center of a circle of salt, I lit the candles and began reciting the ritual. At first, nothing happened. Then the air grew cold, and the flame of each candle flickered wildly. The music box began to play, the melody slow and mournful, and the ballerina spun faster than ever before. The whispers returned, louder than I'd ever heard them. "Stop," they screamed. "You don't understand." But I didn't stop. I kept reciting the ritual, my voice trembling but determined. The shadowy figure appeared, emerging from the glass dome of the music box. She was tall and thin, her face twisted with rage and sorrow. "Free me," she wailed, her voice echoing through the room. With one final line of the ritual, I threw the holy water onto the music box. The shadow let out a piercing scream, then dissolved into the air. The music box shattered, the glass dome breaking into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, the room was silent. And then, just as suddenly, the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight that had hung over our house was gone. I swept up the broken pieces of the music box and buried them in the backyard, making sure they were far away from anyone who might stumble upon them. The whispers stopped, and the shadows disappeared. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the faint echo of a melody drifting on the wind. And I wonder if Lila is truly at peace, or if she's still out there, waiting for someone to find what's left of the music box. My name is Jack, and I'm going to tell you about the silver comb that changed my family forever. The comb wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a piece of silver jewelry passed down through generations. But by the time it reached my sister Claire, it had become something much darker. The comb was beautiful, I'll give it that. It was intricately designed, with delicate engravings of vines and roses, and tiny gemstones set into the handle. My mom told us it belonged to our great-great-grandmother, who was known for her vanity. She'd supposedly used the comb every day, refusing to part with it even as she lay on her deathbed. When my mom inherited it, she didn't think much of it. She kept it in a glass display case in her bedroom, where it stayed for years, untouched and unnoticed, until Claire found it. It was a rainy afternoon when she first opened the case. I remember because I was in my room, trying to finish an essay, when I heard her scream. I rushed into Mom's room and found Claire standing there, clutching the comb. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with something between fear and fascination. "What happened?" I asked. She didn't answer at first. She just stared at the comb, turning it over in her hands. "It feels warm," she finally said. I frowned. "It's just a comb, Claire. Put it back." But she didn't. She ran her fingers over the silver teeth, a strange smile creeping across her face. "I think it's mine now," she whispered. That was the beginning. At first, it seemed harmless. Claire started brushing her hair with the comb every night, and her hair became shinier, healthier, almost unnaturally perfect. She looked stunning, like she belonged in a magazine. But then she became obsessed. She spent hours in front of the mirror, combing her hair over and over again. She stopped hanging out with her friends, stopped coming to family dinners. Her grades dropped, and she barely spoke to anyone, except for occasional mutterings to herself. I started hearing strange noises at night, soft whispers that seemed to come from her room. One evening, I decided to check on her. Her door was slightly open, and I peeked inside. She was sitting at her vanity, combing her hair. The silver comb gleamed in the dim light, and her reflection in the mirror. It wasn't hers. The figure in the mirror looked like Claire, but older, with sunken eyes and a twisted smile. It was watching her, mimicking her movements, but there was something off about it, something wrong. "Claire?" I said, my voice trembling. She didn't turn around. "You should leave," she said, her voice flat and distant. "She doesn't like to be disturbed." "Who's she?" I asked, stepping into the room. Claire finally looked at me, her eyes cold and empty. "She's the owner of the comb," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She lets me borrow it, but only if I take care of it." I felt a chill run down my spine. "That's crazy, Claire. It's just a comb." "No," she said sharply. "It's hers, and she's watching." I left the room, too freaked out to argue. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Claire became more withdrawn, barely eating or sleeping. Her once beautiful hair started falling out, leaving patches of bare scalp. But she didn't seem to care. She just kept combing, her gaze fixed on the mirror. I tried to tell my parents, but they dismissed it as teenage angst. "She's just going through a phase," Mom said. But I knew it was more than that. One night, I woke up to the sound of humming. It was soft and eerie, like a lullaby from another world. I followed the sound to Claire's room. The door was wide open, and the air was freezing. Claire was sitting in front of the mirror again, the comb in her hand. But this time, the figure in the mirror wasn't her. It was a woman. She was old, with long, stringy hair and eyes like black holes. She smiled at me, her teeth sharp and glinting in the dim light. "Join us," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. I grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her away from the mirror. "Let go!" she screamed, thrashing against me. The comb fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. The woman in the mirror let out a shriek, and the glass cracked, splintering into a spiderweb pattern. Claire collapsed, unconscious. I picked up the comb, intending to throw it out, but it burned my hand, forcing me to drop it. The woman in the mirror was gone, but her presence lingered, thick and suffocating. The next morning, I told my parents everything. They didn't believe me until they saw Claire. She was pale and gaunt, her hair almost completely gone. We decided to get rid of the comb. I wrapped it in a cloth and drove to the nearest river, intending to throw it in. But as I stood on the bridge, staring at the rushing water below, I heard the humming again. "Don't," a voice whispered. I looked around, but no one was there. "Give it back," the voice hissed. The cloth in my hands grew heavier, the air around me thick with an oppressive weight. But I didn't listen. I threw the comb into the water and watched it sink, the silver gleaming one last time before disappearing into the depths. When I got home, Claire was better. Her color returned, and her hair started growing back. The whispers stopped, and the mirror in her room shattered completely, leaving nothing behind but shards of glass. We thought it was over, but sometimes when I walk past the river, I hear the faint sound of humming carried on the wind, and I wonder if the comb is waiting for someone else to find it. I'm Lucas, and I grew up in a small town where nothing much ever happened. Our house was old, passed down through my dad's side of the family for generations. Most of the furniture and decorations had been there for decades, and I never thought much about it. But there was one thing we never touched: the mirror in the attic. The attic itself was dusty and crammed with old boxes, broken furniture, and forgotten memories. I hated going up there, and so did my family. But the mirror was different. It stood tall in the far corner, shrouded in a thick, dusty sheet. My dad told me it belonged to his grandmother, but that we should never, ever uncover it. Why not? I asked once when I was about 10. "It's cursed," Dad said flatly. That was all the explanation I got, and honestly, it was enough to keep me away for a long time. But as I got older, my curiosity grew. One summer, when I was 17, I decided to finally take a look. My parents were out, and I had the house to myself. The attic was sweltering, the air thick with the smell of old wood and mildew. I made my way through the maze of boxes and furniture, my heart pounding as I approached the mirror. The sheet covering it was yellowed and brittle, practically disintegrating as I pulled it off. Underneath was the most beautiful mirror I'd ever seen. The frame was ornate, carved with swirling patterns of vines and flowers, and the glass was perfectly clear, despite its age. But something about it felt off. As I stared at my reflection, I noticed a faint shimmer, like the surface of the glass was rippling. I reached out to touch it, and for a split second, it felt warm under my fingertips. That night, I dreamt of the mirror. In my dream, I was standing in front of it again, but my reflection wasn't mine. It was someone else, a young woman with long dark hair and piercing blue eyes. She was wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in the 1800s, and she was smiling at me. But her smile wasn't friendly. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I told myself it was just a dream, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye, like someone was walking past me, but when I turned, no one was there. Doors creaked open on their own, and I'd hear faint whispers in empty rooms. And the mirror, I couldn't stop thinking about it. One evening, I decided to go back to the attic. I wanted to prove to myself that it was just an ordinary mirror, nothing more. When I reached it, the glass seemed darker, almost like it was absorbing the light around it. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't feel like mine. It felt like it was watching me. "Who are you?" I whispered, half expecting no answer. But then, the glass rippled, and the woman from my dream appeared. She looked exactly the same, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders and her piercing blue eyes locked onto mine. "You found me," she said, her voice soft and melodic. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "This isn't real," I muttered. "I'm imagining this." "You're not imagining anything," she said, stepping closer, though she was still inside the mirror. "I've been waiting for someone to free me." "Free you?" I repeated, my voice trembling. She nodded. "I've been trapped here for so long. Please help me." I wanted to run, but something about her voice kept me rooted in place. "How?" I asked. "Break the mirror," she said. It's the only way. I hesitated. Something about her request didn't sit right with me. Why are you trapped? I asked. Her smile faltered, and for a moment, her eyes darkened. I was wronged, she said, her tone turning cold. And now I seek justice. Please, you must help me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but before I could move, the attic door slammed shut behind me. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Break the mirror," she shouted, her voice echoing around the attic. I turned and ran, fumbling with the doorknob until it finally gave way. I didn't stop until I was back in my room, the door locked behind me. That night, the whispers grew louder. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The next morning, I told my dad what had happened. His face went pale. "You uncovered the mirror?" he asked, his voice shaking. I nodded, ashamed and terrified. He took a deep breath and told me the truth. The mirror had belonged to his grandmother, who had been a spiritualist in the early 1900s. She used it for seances, claiming it was a portal to the spirit world. One night, something came through, a spirit that was darker and more powerful than anything she'd encountered before. She trapped it in the mirror, Dad said. But it's not just a spirit. It's a demon. I felt my stomach drop. "We have to destroy it," I said. "We can't," Dad replied. "Breaking the mirror would release it. The only way to contain it is to leave it alone." But the spirit wasn't going to let that happen. Over the next few days, things escalated. Objects flew off shelves, lights flickered, and the whispers turned into screams. My family was terrified, and I knew it was my fault. I decided to end it. Late one night, I went back to the attic, armed with a hammer and a bag of salt. The mirror stood there, as dark and menacing as ever. "You came back," the woman said, appearing in the glass. "I'm not here to free you," I said. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure rage. "Then you'll regret it," she hissed. The attic shook, and the air grew icy. Shadows swirled around me, and her voice echoed in my head, taunting and screaming. I poured the salt in a circle around the mirror and began reciting a banishment prayer I'd found online. The glass cracked, and the woman let out a blood-curdling scream. "You can't get rid of me," she shrieked. "I'll always be here." The shadows dissolved, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The attic went silent. I gathered the shards, careful not to touch them, and buried them far away from the house. The activity stopped, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt normal again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint voice calling my name, and I wonder if I truly ended it, or if she's still out there, waiting to return. I'm Nathaniel, and what I'm about to tell you is something I never thought I'd experience. I always thought that cursed objects were the stuff of legends, something people told stories about to scare children. But then I inherited my grandfather's pocket watch, and everything changed. My grandfather, Jack, was a quiet man. He had a collection of old antiques that he kept locked away in his study, most of which I'd never seen until the day of his funeral. Among them was a tarnished pocket watch that had been in our family for as long as anyone could remember. I'd never paid much attention to it growing up. It just sat there on the shelf, surrounded by other dusty trinkets. When my father handed me the watch after the funeral, he seemed uncomfortable. "Grandpa wanted you to have it," Dad said. "It's yours now." I took the pocket watch, confused. It was heavy in my palm, and the brass was worn down from years of handling. There was an engraving on the back, but I couldn't make out the words at first glance. That night, I decided to wind the watch. I don't know why I did it. I just felt an odd urge to hear it tick. When I turned the crown, the hands jerked to life. The watch gave off a soft, ticking sound that felt oddly comforting. I checked the time. It was 10 p.m., but the watch said 9 o'clock. I shrugged, assuming it was broken, and went to bed. I wish I had left it there. The next day, things started to get strange. I woke up late for work, but when I checked the clock on my nightstand, it was still 9 o'clock. My phone, my computer, even the microwave, they all said the same thing. I checked the pocket watch again, and the hands had moved, now pointing to 8:45. Confused, I took the watch downstairs to my dad. "It's broken," I said. "It's like it's rewinding itself." Dad looked at the watch, his face turning pale. "That's not possible," he muttered. "Your grandfather always kept it on time." He stopped himself, shaking his head as if he didn't want to continue. "It's just a watch, Dad," I said, but something about the way he looked at me made me uneasy. I decided to keep the watch anyway. Over the next few days, it became more and more apparent that it wasn't just broken. It was messing with time. One evening, I arrived at a dinner party I had been invited to. When I checked my phone, I saw that I was an hour late. But when I looked at the pocket watch, it said the correct time, on the dot. I asked around, and everyone confirmed that I was late. But there was no explanation for how the watch seemed to work perfectly while everything else was out of sync. It didn't stop there. The next morning, I went to grab coffee at my usual cafe. As I stood in line, I noticed a man sitting at a table, watching me. He was wearing a gray suit and had a strange, almost predatory expression on his face. I glanced at the watch, still working as always. But when I looked up again, the man was gone. I walked to the counter, and the barista handed me my coffee. "Did you see that man sitting there?" I asked. She looked at me like I was crazy. "There's no one there," she said, shaking her head. My heart started racing. I glanced at the watch again, and the hands were creeping backward, slowly, almost imperceptibly. That night, I had the most disturbing dream. I was back at my grandfather's house, standing in his study, surrounded by his antiques. I looked down at the pocket watch in my hand, and it was ticking loudly, but no matter how much I wound it, the hands kept turning back. Suddenly, I heard a voice. "You've come for it." I turned around, and there was my grandfather, standing in the doorway, his eyes dark and hollow. "I never meant for this to happen," he said. "I never wanted you to inherit it." I woke up gasping for air. My sheets were soaked with sweat, and the pocket watch was lying beside my bed, ticking steadily. The next morning, I asked my father about the watch. "Dad, what's going on with it? Why did Grandpa give it to me?" Dad sighed deeply, his eyes clouded with guilt. "Your grandfather didn't always have that watch," he said quietly. "It was given to him by a stranger when he was a young man. A man who promised him that it would bring him everything he wanted. Fortune, power, success. But the price was steep." "What price?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The watch? It's cursed," Dad said, his voice shaking. "It doesn't just track time. It controls it. It rewinds, fast forwards, and distorts reality itself. But anyone who owns it is doomed. Time slips away from them, and they lose their sense of self. Grandpa wasn't the first one to fall victim to it." I looked at the watch in my hand, my heart pounding. "But why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked. "I thought you were old enough to make your own choice," he replied. "But now, I see I was wrong." That night, things got worse. I found myself slipping in and out of reality. I'd be sitting at my desk at work, and then suddenly, I'd be standing in my kitchen, looking at the clock, which would read 3 a.m. when it was really 9 p.m. Time was warping. People's faces would blur when I looked at them too long, like they weren't entirely real. The worst part was the shadows. They seemed to follow me, dark figures that I'd catch out of the corner of my eye, just standing in the distance, watching me. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then they started to get closer. I saw one standing at the foot of my bed, watching me sleep, and the whispers, voices from the past, the present, and the future, all seemed to come from the watch. "Help me," they would say. "Time is slipping away." I had to destroy it. I took the watch and ran to the river, my hands shaking as I stood at the edge. But the moment I was about to throw it in, I heard my grandfather's voice. "Don't do it." I turned around, and there he was, just as he had been in my dream, standing in the doorway of my grandfather's study. "You'll never escape," he whispered. "The watch will always find its way back to you." I threw it in the river anyway, watching as the current carried it away. But when I got home, I found the pocket watch on my kitchen counter, ticking away as though nothing had ever happened. And now, it's like time is no longer mine to control. Every day feels like I'm slipping further and further away. The watch keeps coming back, no matter what I do. I'm trapped, and I know I'll never escape. If you ever come across an old pocket watch, don't touch it. Don't wind it. Don't even look at it. Because once it's in your hands, time is no longer on your side.